The Inbound Directory connector allows you to associate inbound routes with local or UNC folder paths. It supports a secondary properties file with transmission information, which can be styled to interface with third-party document management systems or other applications. It's useful for creating custom workflows or archives, or interfacing with any system that uses drop folder style messaging. The Routing tab allows you to create multiple routing configurations. Note that these aren't the routes themselves. These only represent the inbound message delivery options. First is the system address of this configuration. Do you want to store the message file content? Do you want to store the secondary properties file? Do you want to split the incoming TIFF into multiple pages? And if so, how do you want to number those pages? You can set the date-time format to use with the properties styler. The file name extension of the secondary properties file, and the style sheet to use to create that secondary properties file, independent of the file name extension. You can configure the file name template. Including the Faxination job ID in the file name will ensure that the file names are unique. And you can enable and disable this configuration without deleting it. Now we'll look at how an Inbound Directory Connector user entity is configured in the Faxination Address Manager. On the General tab, you can give a friendly name to this Faxination user entity. The primary address is the local or UNC path where the messages will be delivered. The host connector that is associated with this user, the type of address that is appropriate for that connector, and the system address, which is matched to the message delivery options that we've already defined within the connector. The remaining fields on the General tab are not relevant to an inbound-only host. The Routing tab is used to assign inbound routing codes to this user. And on the Fax tab, the only applicable field is the inbound file type. Now we move on to the Faxination MS SharePoint connector. This is an inbound-only host connector that can route fax and mobile messages to one or more SharePoint document libraries. Like the Inbound Directory connector, it can store the message payload information and/or message transmission information. It can map Faxination message fields to SharePoint metadata columns. It's often used to trigger SharePoint workflow rules or to create custom message archives. When licensed and installed, it also adds the option of logging to a SharePoint custom list as an alternative or in addition to the default SQL log. The SharePoint Sites tab is used to configure one or more SharePoint-based URLs for inbound message delivery. You can specify a friendly name for this SharePoint site configuration, and the system address used to associate Faxination user entities with this configuration. You can also enable and disable this configuration without deleting it. On the Client Connection tab, you can set the base URL for this Faxination route. The base URL plus the system address equals the full SharePoint destination URL. Set the authentication type. Office 365 uses a different authentication mechanism to on-premise SharePoint. And here you set the credentials for SharePoint write access. On the Content tab, you can choose to store the message body text of the message, the attachments, or both. The file name template has the same constructor as the Inbound Directory connector. The Message Columns tab allows you to populate the SharePoint document library columns with metadata, which can come from Faxination fields or hard-coded explicit data that is unique to this configuration. Here we're populating the From, Job ID, and Subject fields with Faxination message properties. And those fields are populated for each message that is written to the SharePoint document library. When the SharePoint connector is licensed and installed, logging to a SharePoint custom list becomes an option within the Faxination Server Configurator Logging tab. This can be used as an alternative to the default SQL logging, or both logs may be enabled simultaneously.